All right, this is a combination video. Chapter 3 and Chapter 5 kind of fit together, so we're doing them together in one video, um, possibly two videos depending on how long this video runs. So this is potentially part 1 of 2 videos. Okay, Lesson 3 is about the probability of compound events. Lesson 5 is about something called the fundamental counting principle. So let's get started with some vocab. All right, first word is sample space. A sample space is a list of all the possible outcomes of a probability experiment. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to bounce back and forth for this video between vocab words and examples of them. So here's an example, or a couple examples actually. So to find the sample space, this is when we take a look at all the possible outcomes in a probability experiment. So our first example is to flip a coin once. Well, if we flip a coin one time, we know that we can get heads or we can get tails. So those are the two possible outcomes. I've listed both of them, so that's my sample space. Let's look at another example. If I roll a die one time, okay, rolling a die one time, all the possible outcomes are all the possible faces of the die. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So those are the possible outcomes. Those, when I list them all, we call it the sample space. Now, something unusual here, if I flip a coin twice, first of all, this is a special type of probability called compound events. So let's bounce back up to your vocab here. We're going to skip down to this word. Compound events are two or more events that happen together in a probability problem. Okay, so when we talk about compound events, it's when we're not just doing something once, we're doing it 2 times or 3 times. So we're not just flipping a coin once, we're flipping it twice or 3 times or 4 times. We're not just rolling a die once, we're rolling it once or twice or 3 times. That makes it compound because there's more than one step involved. So back to my example here. If I flip a coin twice, now I get a more complicated sample space to list. It's not too hard because we're only flipping a coin twice and there's not a lot of outcomes, but it can get kind of tricky if we aren't methodical when we list our outcomes. So let's do this methodically. I could get heads on the first flip and I could get heads again on the second flip. I could get heads on the first flip. I could get tails on the second flip. I could get tails on the first flip. I could get heads on the second flip. And I could get tails on the first flip and tails on the second flip. So like I said, this is a little bit more of a complicated sample space. There's only 4 outcomes, but you have to make sure you don't list any twice. You have to make sure that you don't miss any. All right? Back to our vocab. Another vocab word here is tree diagram. This was the one we skipped. A tree diagram is a diagram that we can use to list all the outcomes in a sample space. So it's a way to help us list, especially for compound events, and make sure that we don't miss any or repeat any of our outcomes. So let's take a look at what a tree diagram looks like. This is the example we already did in the last problem. We flip a coin twice. We saw how to make that list. It wasn't really complicated, but let's see how a tree diagram might help speed things up. So the first thing we do is we say, okay, I'm going to focus on flip 1. In my first flip, I have 2 possible outcomes. I could get heads or I could get tails. I'm listing these vertically. Take note to that. I'm going to draw a little caret connecting them. Now I'm going to focus on my second flip. In my second flip, I'm doing this flip after my first flip. If I had gotten heads on the first flip, now I could still get heads or tails on my second flip. If I had gotten tails on the first flip, I could still get heads or tails on the second flip. Okay, excuse me. So this is what a tree diagram would look like. Here's how we read it. We read it starting at our point, and we read each branch. So our first branch would be HH. Second branch would be HT. Third branch, TH. Fourth branch, T, T. And that helps me to create my sample space. That helps me to create my list of all the possible outcomes. So I'm going to do something here. I want to clone this. All right. Now we want to see what it looks like if we flip a coin 3 times. So the first 2 flips, I'm just, copying down below, heads or tails. Then I can get heads or tails off each one of those flips. Now I'm going to focus on my third flip. Third flip. Well, this this flip happens after the second flip. So if I had gotten heads on the second flip, I could still get heads or tails on the third flip. If I had gotten tails on the second flip, I could still get heads or tails on the third flip. If I had gotten heads on the second flip, I could still get heads or tails on the third flip. And if I had gotten tails on the second flip, I could have still gotten heads or tails on the third flip. So now my tree diagram got a little bit wider, a little bit more complicated. Again, here's how we read it. Heads, 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 tails. Heads, tails, heads, heads, tails, tails. Tails, heads, heads, tails, heads, tails, 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 heads, tails, tails, tails. And what I could do with this tree diagram is write out each of those outcomes to help make my sample space. I have one more example for a tree diagram. This is one where the steps are different. So my first step, I'm going to roll a die, and my second step, I will flip a coin. So first step, I'm going to roll a die. The outcomes when I roll a die are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. So to make this look like a tree, we bring all of those outcomes back to a starting point, like this. And now we'll talk about our second flip, or second step. Second step is when we flip the coin. So, assuming we get a 1 on the first step, we can get heads or tails when we flip a coin. If we roll a 2, we can get heads or tails when we flip that coin. If we roll a 3, we could flip and get heads or tails. If we roll a 4, we could flip and get heads or tails. If we roll a 5, we could flip and get heads or tails. And the same thing if we roll a 6. We could use our tree diagram to make our list of all the possible outcomes in the sample space. 1H, 1T, 2H, 2T, 3H, 3T, 4H, 4T, 5H, 5T, 6H, 6T. This is where we're going to end the first video, and you can tune in for the second video to finish up this lesson.